All right, 2 minutes to midnight. This is the review, and sometimes I may forget to do this in the review portion. But wow, this chair is funky. I haven't sat in it in a long time. This was a review copy, so I want to clarify that for whenever it matters. No personal relation with the designer or anything like that. Although our communications over the game, he seems like a pretty cool guy, from what I can tell. But I don't think any of that influences me too much. If you watch, through the review, through the intro and the playthrough, you can see how I kind of struggled with the game, and that will interact here. So the first thing I had to do, and I don't do this with all games, is go into a little bit of the history of the genre, and at least my relation with it, because it isn't all that common. I know there's Twilight Struggle, but back, I think in the late 60s, maybe early 70s, through the 80s, there were a number of games that tried to portray a Cold War type atmosphere. And these will be the things that you have to compare this, along with Twilight Struggle, to. Those games, the early games, were all multiplayer games, and I can think of a few off the top of my head. The first one I can think of is Summit, which was kind of a flawed game at a very high level, but very interesting. I haven't been able to cover it. I don't think it's made it here. I think it's still in, I guess, what's now my dad's basement, now that my mom's dead. And may someday be like my brother's basement or something, somehow. I don't know. It'll never be my place, but anyway. It's got a huge box, so it was hard to ship, and I didn't bring that up, but that's basically, I think, handles 4 powers, maybe 6, no, 6 powers, 6 possible powers. Which, that doesn't reflect the bipolar nature of the Cold War. But it's set in that kind of Cold War or post-70s era. It feels more like pure Cold War because nothing's set up at the beginning, but it's all very abstract and not really based that much on history, more based on here things you could do, whatever. A little bit better than that was Victory Games' Cold War, but again, a 4-power game. And I don't think there was a whole hell of a lot of detail to try to link it to the real world. A little bit more was tried. It's a little bit better game. And then there were, I can think of at least one really horrible thing. Games Workshop put out something called Superpower, which is kind of fun to play maybe, but it's sort of like Monopoly with nations. You're moving around the board and just getting countries that way. Although there are different techniques for being able to do things, and things like coups and stuff like that exist in it. The big watershed, though, was definitely Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle came out with this, hey, here we've got the historical events happening, and a starting position that's right after World War II. It really documents that whole the Cold War period, which maybe had to wait until after the Cold War period was gone in order to do. You can see attempts for things that were done kind of at the same time. Soon after Twilight Struggle, there was Labyrinth, which was largely about dealing with kind of the post 9/11 world. Well, that game has required updates, expansions and whatnot to cover the period that came after the initial design. But it was a serious attempt, just like Twilight Struggle was, to give a historical view of this. So this is sort of on that same level as Twilight Struggle, but instead of, there are certain things Twilight Struggle had to do to make it the competitive masterpiece that it really is. People love Twilight Struggle as a competitive game, and I totally understand that. But certain compromises had to be made, some of which, the deck is only a certain size. There's this attempt to make every card matter so that you have to make, agonizing decisions on every play. This is the kind of thing that people wanted, and many people still do. It's a fairly simple game. It didn't have a whole lot of different mechanisms that you could bring into play. It didn't really have a whole lot of different levers you could pull. And so for all that Twilight Struggle's a great game, it didn't really serve as that sort of deeper, more complete simulation. This game feels like an attempt, well, it is, an attempt to go for a little bit more depth of simulation. Now, there's obvious costs to that, though, right? It is not, first of all, as you add more and more to a game, and there's a lot here, you can just see it from the size of the deck that, or decks that it has, because they're all time related. And I don't know if there's that many more historical events. So like every event in Twilight Struggle is almost intrinsically linked to, except for some of the game related things like scoring cards and stuff, is almost intrinsically related to an event that happened or one that almost happened but came close, right? Close enough that it made the news, and then there's sort of the postulate, well, what if it had gone further? And you have this challenge in Twilight Struggle of trying to, decide whether or not the event card gives you something that you want that's better than the goals that you would pursue otherwise from what that card allows you. This game does not do that. What this game gives you is a bunch of, there's still a fair number, maybe about as many historical events baked into this thing. But there's also a lot more generic events. And one of the reasons behind that is that essentially cards are what drive your capability to do anything. There's almost nothing you can do outside of being drawn by a card. Now you could say that with Twilight Struggle. You have the same thing. The cards drive your actions, right? And you have this first choice of, do you want an event, or do you want to pay, do you want to play for the points that it gives you? So every card is what drives the action, but the points are sort of a baseline. Every card gives you the option to do a bunch of stuff. In this case, most of the cards do not give you an option to do much. Most of them you're just going to be flipping over and see what happens to you. And you may have some minor choices within that what happens. The actual cards that you have real autonomy with are your money cards. Your money cards give you a sequence of, well, they say 11 possible actions. The reality is one of those actions isn't triggered by money cards. Some of them are only available to some players. Some of the possible actions are basically menu item choices. So you could make 2 influence rolls, or an influence roll and an investment, or 2 investments. Just a series of different things that you can make as choices that are basically similar to the amount of choices that you get with a set of points on 1 or 2 individual cards from Twilight Struggle. And yes, I'm assuming some familiarity with Twilight Struggle because it was such a popular game, is such a popular game. And this really needs to be seen in that light. This is a more complex game with a lot more levers. It feels a lot harder to make decisions in. While I say that the decisions, you have a lot more decisions in Twilight Struggle, and everyone fucking counts, basically. But the decisions in Twilight Struggle are usually over a fairly limited number of choices. It's enough choices to still be able to give an interesting game, which is more than I can say about CDGs that are a little too limited. So some of the really stripped down CDGs, and there have been some since Twilight Struggle. I would look at, I think there's one, I don't remember what it's called. There's a spy versus spy one that's basically just a stripped down single track manipulation. 1955, I think it's called, and then 13 Days. Neither of which really impressed me. I've seen some other stripped down CDGs that don't have as many choices as even Twilight Struggle that can still manage. Different topic, but Fort Sumter by now I'm lost, by the inventor of the CDG, Mark Herman. I should be able to remember these things. That actually seems to hold together a little bit better than some that even have more options in them. It just holds up. But this game doesn't use that CDG mechanism. It uses something that feels kind of it's different. Let's just put it that way. It shows similarities with the CDGs, drawing a card, but you don't have a handful of cards, right? And making choices based on the card. But here you're flipping over a card, making your choice if you're given one. It may just be an event that something happens. It may be an event that something happens and it lets you do something. It may be a money card which gives you the opportunity to play where you want if you haven't handcuffed yourself throughout the world. In that, it's sort of similar in some ways to the coin systems, where you're flipping over a card and different people get an option to do something on that card, and they may do different things from it. The historical event often gets triggered by someone, but other people often want to just do their own thing. In this, you don't have that kind of choice. The card gets flipped over, and what the card is determines what happens if it's a random event, and which people get to act from it, again from the random event. Or it's a money card where one person gets to do a couple of different actions of interest. I found that the number of levers that are available, the amount of opportunity to play around with things, the limited resources you have, all provided a whole lot of challenge in this game. This game really, really forced me to make hard choices in a way that I don't even feel like towards the end of the game in this, and it's a much longer game than, say, Twilight Struggle, I felt like I was still being forced to make choices that I was unprepared to be able to decide. Maybe you feel that way early on in the first couple turns of Twilight Struggle or of a coin game, but usually you find the pattern and the things that you want to do in that. Here, one of the things is the pattern changes. Kind of similar to Le Grand Guerre. The rules don't change, but the value of things changes enough by some of the long-term effects of the cards, where building up industry in countries becomes easier and easier, that sort of the collateral effects are less predictable, and things emerge from it that you're not going to see, certainly in your first play. And unfortunately, I've only played through it once. So I can't give you anything about sort of the staying power of the game. I don't look at games long enough anymore for that to even really matter much. I mean, chances are I will maybe pull this out another 1 or 2 times in my lifetime, just given the quantity of crap that I have. And you're lucky I'm not forcing you to look at the piles of shelving of more Euro-type games that I have down here. But yeah, this provides you with a deeper look at the history, definitely, at the options, and maybe sort of the cause and effects of what you're trying to do. Victory itself is assessed largely by traveling along this progress track. And basically by getting full control of an area, a country, whatever, I mean, sometimes it's more than one country, in terms of having both influence in that country politically and having the same political system of government in that area. Then you get the value of the industry of that region in terms of movement on here. There are other things that can give you movement on here for no question at all. And then there's also things like reforms in Russia that can give you a whole victory point, as it were. Because each time you spiral through this, or each time you slide through this, each time you wrap around, you get a victory point. And each time you wrap the other way, you lose one. Anyway, let's take a look at components, and then I'll go into a little bit more depth. I mean, one of the things I want to get out of the way, though, in my first, looking at the rules and having played through it, I have to say the game is still underdeveloped. And that is highly likely to be the case by the time of release. In fact, there are elements of the game that are just hard to develop. One of the things is there's some ambiguity in the rules. I think another round of development could nail down those factors. Some of them have been cleaned up since this version. Many of them have not. Most of the cases that I went to look have not. There is more ambiguity in some of the cards. That would be a harder development task. You would basically have to go through this and define certain terms with basically a glossary, and define them in such a way that they're iron-bound and that they can only be interpreted one way. Because sometimes terms are used that aren't available anywhere except in the card. Another factor that would be helpful for that would be the addition of a cheat sheet that referred to maybe not all the cards, but most of them, many of them, and that would be quite an undertaking given the size of the deck. Because the truth of the matter is the cards just aren't big enough to hold all the information that needs to be handled. Now, it would be possible for predefined terms to cut that number of cards that have the need for some kind of cheat sheet much further down. But I don't think it could eliminate it completely. And this is the sort of problem that the game has, right? That's almost intrinsic to the design. It makes it hard to develop. Another factor is the way the rulebook itself is structured and interleaved. And that's something that I've kind of tried to put my finger on. Is there any way you could fix that? And nothing comes to my mind easily, honestly. The truth of the matter is that there are basically things that have to be defined that are interrelated in a way that you'd have to either restate them or refer back better than the rulebook does, whatever. It doesn't do a great job of what it's doing. It certainly doesn't do the best job that's possible, but the perfect job for this rulebook, for this game, may not be even plausible. Is one of the things I'm saying. What all that means is that this is going to never be the kind of competitive tournament type game that Twilight Struggles managed to be. It's also a little long for that. They talk about it as 2 to 6 hours. I played the full thing through, and you can see how many hours of video there are on it. Obviously, it could go shorter than my videos do. I throw in a lot of extraneous comments. My thinking is, I suffer from a certain level of analysis paralysis when I'm looking at especially at new situations that I don't have a nice pattern for. So yes, it can go down from that, but I think it's probably going to be closer to 9 hours unless you have, for the full game, unless you have really, really dedicated people who are so totally into the game that they push through with no conversation, no extraneous stuff going on at all, and are just so devoted to the game that they're immediately making their decisions and thinking about everything they might do depending on whatever the card might come up. Because you don't know what your choices are until the card comes up. You could be continuously thinking. So in a lot of Euros, the way to get around analysis paralysis is for the players, and I better swap this out, for the players to be thinking about their next turn, but you don't know when your next turn comes up, essentially, in this game. And so that kind of shortcut is just not going to be plausible for this. All that said, if you're going to be getting the game as it is going to be released, and it probably will not get reprints, I wouldn't count on it getting them, because, you know, it's not Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle is that very broad-reaching in terms of the audience type of game. It appeals to people who are interested in the history. There really hadn't been anything of this nature before that was out there. It appeals to the very, very competitive player, because you can really kind of memorize the decks and figure out, you know, how to optimize your strategy given how the game's played out so far, whatever. And you have a lot of control over what's going on. In this game, you have a lot less control. So Twilight Struggle really kind of, you know, captured a broad audience. I don't think this has that kind of broad audience appeal. So, like many other games, it'll find its market, but how much, you know, how many chances you're going to get at it new is not very good. So I wouldn't be thinking about waiting around and hoping that it gets redeveloped if you are interested in it. I'm not trying to sell it here. I mean, you know, maybe it'll show up on the used market as well. I wanted to talk about components. That's hard to talk about because these are not the final components for the game by any means. But they did a damn good job, actually impressively good. So you've got a rather large, and I'm not going to blow it all out, you can look at the playthroughs to see it, map of the world. Much, much more space than Twilight Struggle takes up. And my first thought was, wow, they threw a little too much in. You know, it needs it. A lot of pieces go on the board in this game. Maybe not everywhere, but there are areas where you would not want this board to be shrunk down. You have something I haven't talked about, which is kind of cool, which is a fairly detailed tech, tree isn't quite the word for it, but chart. And you're going to be racing in various levels of technology against each other. You also have a tracking of various balances here of different military capabilities and intelligence capabilities, which impact your ability to do things on the board. And this is, you know, this is very different. Like, if you look at Twilight Struggle, oh, hey, you've got more, one side gets more nukes, or there's something like that. That just causes some effect on a fairly limited set of game state factors that are in play in Twilight Struggle. Oh, there's stupid power. Ugh. I've got that down with my Euros for some reason. I don't know what to do with that one, because it really is kind of like Monopoly with the world. But yeah, so in this one you have so many more levers to play with that it explores the whole realm of things. Hey, that nuclear balance is important towards whether or not things can get invaded. The conventional balance is important as to whether or not you actually can succeed if you just go attack something. And then the naval balance is important because, well, some things can only be reached by water, among other things. And it's also important in terms of the nuclear, the capability to deploy nuclear weapons within range of the enemy. There's a real attempt to try and capture causal relationships in this game in a way. Wow, I'm gonna have trouble getting all these thick card decks in here. There's definitely an attempt to provide those causal relationships, and that's really important to me. That's something that, you know, was more present in some of the earlier games, those multiplayer games, but at a very, very abstract level. Here, they're doing a pretty good job of trying to show that kind of relationship. This card is simply to allow the two-player game so that both people don't have to sit on the same side to have the chart facing them. There's a couple copies of these play aids, which give many of the rules that you need clipped out in some charts and whatnot. There's a bunch of these scenario setup cards, which spend a lot of effort showing you the game state as a picture. I'll give you a little bit more information. The game state is described perfectly well in here as to what things get set up. It could be helpful for later aspects. There's a bunch of wooden cubes to show influence, markers for the military capabilities, investments, whatever. A whole bunch of stuff, wooden and counter to show you, what that game state currently is. Unrest in various nations, which gives you opportunities that you wouldn't have otherwise. And then the big thing is the cards, which of course, even in this playtest version, because it's possible now, are all poker quality cards. They're real playing cards. And I put everything the wrong way. In the wrong box. There we go. Now, I do have to emphasize, it is a big deal, the development flaws in this game. My first feeling is that I probably, unless somebody was really gung-ho about this particular topic and wanted more depth than Twilight Struggle, I probably would never bring this to play with someone else. I probably would keep it as a solo game. And I want to make one note, there's a bot for it, which includes some additional cards to run it as a solo game. I did not do that. I always play both hats, but bots are really popular right now, and I can see the why of it. As a solo game, though, it goes into that depth more than Twilight Struggle does. Gives you a better story. So in a lot of ways, I have to say, this to me is the best game on that Cold War subject that's out there. Now, there aren't all that many others out there, and I can maybe think of something, at least for my tastes, I can maybe think of something that would appeal to me more, some prospective imaginary game that's more like a Europa Universalis set in this period. But this kind of tries to get to that, right? It gets to that with that really heavy event-driven type thing. The only real difference is the concession that people want playing cards, that easy flip and see what happens, rather than, rolling dice and looking up on charts and all that. And I fully understand that. It has sort of a consistent level of detail throughout the game. So again, if I was drawing more, I would say, well, maybe there could be something that's got even more details in it and everything. But then you start getting into, well, the historical events have to get deeper and deeper and have to be more hypothetical type things. And the game does cover some hypotheticals in here outside of the sort of the actions that the players might take that are different from the historical actions. There are event cards. So most event cards have multiple different possible outcomes that you can get out of them, which means you might end up with Israel never developing a nuclear bomb, with the UK never getting one. It's possible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. Twilight Struggle has its own way to prevent events from happening. or from creating a branching. But that way tends to be more about who gets the card, whether they like the event and want to play it. Stuff like that ends up being more the factor in there. Here it's just a die roll, which I guess is about the same kind of thing. It's a random situation, a little bit less player control over it. Yeah, no, I'm really impressed with the idea of the game and how it handles things in general. The problem that I have with it is you will have to be interpreting cards at least as you go. And again, there were things that could be done about that. That maybe further development or throwing more money at it could have managed. Is that big a deal? I mean, if you like the game and you like the idea enough, you're willing to make that work. But that works fine in solo. That works a little less fine when you're playing these games opposed. When you're playing a game opposed and a dispute of that nature comes up, sure, eventually you can come down to, okay, we've got differing ideas on this after arguing it out for 10 minutes. Let's throw a die and make a decision. And you get to keep going. But you'd kind of rather avoid that if you could, right? Anyway, there's, a good side and a bad side to this. I really like what it's trying to do, but the development effort is a little less than one would do. Well, yeah, it is less than what one would desire. We won't go to a lot less, but yeah, it's not just a little less. It's not just a little rough around the edges. It's got some serious things that people could challenge. There were maybe at least once per turn a point where I'm like making a decision where I think it could have gone either way in terms of the rulebook, which is definitely well under optimal. Anyhow, that's the look at it. I am glad to have it. And this is something that, again, I could see myself pulling out again a couple more times in my life, which more and more is becoming less and less the case. Like most games, I'm like, yeah, I'm just not going to ever get another chance to play because I'm still 500 games in the hole in terms of what I've got played, and they keep printing more. And yeah, I'm trying to cut back, but it's hard. It's hard. All right. Cheers, folks.